There's a liquid sitting in your hardware store right now for under $3. It resurrects cracked, gray, sun-destroyed wood without paint, without stain, without a single hour of sanding. One coat on a rotting fence and your neighbors assume you hired a crew. One pass on a weathered deck, and the contractor you almost called loses a $1,200 job. Furniture that looked one season away from a dumpster suddenly looks like it belongs behind museum glass. No power tools, no experience, no appointment with someone who charges $80 an hour to do what you're about to learn in the next 10 minutes. This formula is older than your country. Craftsmen in the 1800s knew it by name. Shipbuilders used it to keep wooden vessels alive in salt water for decades. Furniture makers passed it down through apprenticeships like a trade secret worth protecting. And then something happened. The chemical industry looked at a $2 solution and saw a catastrophic threat to a $2 billion market. So they did what every industry does when a cheap answer threatens an expensive product. They buried it. Not because it stopped working, because it worked too well. This is the story of what they hid and exactly how to make it yourself before the weekend is over. Welcome to Forbidden Camping. Hit subscribe and the bell right now because this is where buried knowledge comes back to the surface. Let's go back to where this formula actually begins. Not the 1950s, not the 1930s. Further, the flax plant was being cultivated in ancient Mesopotamia before writing existed. Egyptian linen woven from flax fiber has survived inside sealed tombs for 4,000 years without rotting. And in ancient China, woodworkers discovered that pressing flax seeds produced a golden oil that soaked into timber and hardened over time into something harder than most paints we sell today. That oil was linseed oil, the first wood finish in recorded human history. Not a product of a laboratory, not a branded solution from a corporation. Oil from a seed, pressed by hand, rubbed into wood with cloth. And for centuries, every cabinet maker, every shipbuilder, every craftsman on earth knew exactly what it did. Medieval European builders mixed linseed oil with lead oxide to create a fast-drying version. Cathedral doors, treated with that mixture in the 1500s, are still standing today. British naval ships coated their decks before crossing the Atlantic, and the wood survived. Salt spray, tropical sun, and cannon fire. In the American frontier, settlers used linseed oil on wooden wagon wheels, tool handles, barn doors, and cabin floors. It was not exotic. It was not secret. It was as common as flour and as essential as water. Then the 1950s arrived. The petrochemical industry introduced synthetic resins, polyurethane, lacquer, chemical varnish. These products were shinier, faster to apply, and infinitely more profitable to manufacture and sell. Linseed oil cost pennies per gallon. Synthetic finish cost dollars per quart and required reapplication every 2 to 3 years. The industry did not switch because the new products performed better. They switched because the new products generated repeat revenue. Linseed oil, once applied correctly, stays inside the wood for years. That is a terrible business model if your goal is quarterly earnings. So the formula disappeared from shelves, from training guides, from home improvement shows, and eventually from living memory. One generation stopped teaching. It because television told them there was a better way. There was not a better way. There was just a more expensive way. Before I go further, I need to pause and tell you something. This video is one piece of a much larger picture. I spent months pulling together everything the outdoor and home industry has quietly removed from public knowledge into a single place. Fire techniques that military survival instructors once taught openly and that have since been scrubbed from public training manuals. Emergency shelters built from materials that cost nothing and that outperform $300 commercial tents in field tests. DIY water filtration systems that engineers tested and refused to believe actually worked that well. Food preservation methods that kept meat and vegetables viable for months without power or refrigeration. Indigenous insect repellent formulas that pharmaceutical companies have quietly studied and never publicly credited. All of it is inside the complete Forbidden Camping Vault. The Forbidden Firecraft manual alone contains 17 techniques removed from mainstream outdoor education. The Lost Rations cookbook has field recipes that kept soldiers functional when supply chains collapsed entirely. The full off-grid blueprint covers water, shelter, food, and power in one single document. Over 10 guides, no filler, no padding, just what works. The link is in the description directly below this video. But stay right here because what comes next is the science that explains everything. Here's what happens inside the wood when this liquid touches it. Linseed oil is a triglyceride with an unusually high concentration of a compound called alpha-linolenic acid. That is a polyunsaturated fatty acid. When it contacts oxygen, it triggers a process called autoxidation. The fatty acid chains begin linking to each other chemically and forming a polymer network, a natural resin built from oil and air. But what makes this remarkable is where that reaction happens. Unlike paint, which hardens on top of the surface, linseed oil penetrates into the cellular structure of the wood itself before it begins to harden. It does not coat the grain, it becomes part of the grain. A study published in the Journal of Coatings Technology confirmed that linseed oil penetrates wood up to 4 times deeper than synthetic polyurethane. Polyurethane sits on top of wood like a plastic shell. One crack in that shell and moisture rushes underneath, lifts the coating, and the board rots from below while looking protected from above. That is why polyurethane decks blister, peel, and gray out within 3 seasons, regardless of what the label promises. Linseed oil does not peel because it has nowhere to peel from. It is inside the wood. Now add white vinegar to the formula. Vinegar is acetic acid, one of the oldest naturally occurring chemical compounds on Earth. When it contacts weathered wood, it dissolves oxidation, embedded grime, and the dead surface layer of old finish without damaging the healthy fibers underneath. The gray color that makes old wood look destroyed is mostly surface oxidation. The vinegar strips that layer on contact. What you see underneath is the original wood grain, suddenly exposed and ready to absorb. The third ingredient is the unlock. Turpentine, a natural solvent distilled from pine tree resin since before the ancient Greeks. When added to linseed oil, it thins the viscosity just enough that the oil penetrates twice as deep into the grain and begins curing twice as fast. Without turpentine, the oil pools on the surface and takes weeks to fully harden. With turpentine, it soaks through within minutes and begins hardening within hours. 3 ingredients working in sequence. Vinegar strips the damage. Linseed oil floods the exposed grain and polymerizes inside the fiber. Turpentine drives the oil deeper and accelerates the cure. Total cost at any hardware store is under $3 per application. A quart of boiled linseed oil runs about $4. A gallon of white distilled vinegar costs under $3. A small can of turpentine runs around $5 and lasts for months of applications. Now look at what a contractor quotes for the same result. The national average cost to refinish a 200 square foot deck is $980. Labor alone runs between $600 and $400 for a job that takes 1 to 3 days. A single antique furniture restoration costs between $300 and $800 at a shop. And the active chemical foundation most professionals use in their oil-based restoration process? The same drying oil chemistry that has existed since before the American Civil War. The markup is not on skill. The markup is on your assumption that this requires expertise you do not have. Now here is why this formula cannot be suppressed through patents. You cannot patent linseed oil because it is a natural substance that has existed for 20,000 years. You cannot patent vinegar because acetic acid predates recorded history. You cannot patent turpentine because humans have been distilling it from pine resin since antiquity. There is no proprietary molecule, no trade secret, no intellectual property to protect. And what cannot be patented cannot generate licensing fees. What cannot be licensed cannot build a distribution monopoly. What cannot be monopolized cannot fund television advertising. So the formula does not get suppressed through legal mechanisms. It gets suppressed through invisibility. The first page of any search engine results for wood restoration is dominated by paid advertisements from branded product companies. Every home improvement television show features a host recommending a product with a logo on the bottle. No one has a financial incentive to mention that the active ingredient in that $28 bottle costs less than 40 cents to source yourself. The suppression is not a meeting in a corporate boardroom. It is simply a market that rewards complexity and punishes simplicity. When the solution is cheap, unpatentable, and requires no equipment, no company profits from its promotion. So it disappears from public knowledge 1 generation at a time. Now here is exactly how to make and use it. 1 part boiled linseed oil. The can must say boiled on the label because raw linseed oil without metallic drying catalysts takes weeks to cure in humid conditions. 1 part white distilled vinegar. 1 part turpentine, also called gum spirits found in the paint aisle. Combine equal parts of all 3 in a glass jar. Seal the lid tightly and shake for 30 seconds until the mixture emulsifies into a cloudy golden liquid. Clean the wood surface with a dry brush to remove loose debris. No sanding, no power washing, no stripping required. Dip a clean cotton rag into the mixture and apply it along the grain using firm, even strokes, working in sections about 2 feet wide. Let the first coat absorb for 10 to 15 minutes, then wipe away any excess with a dry cloth. Wait 24 hours and apply a second coat the same way. The second coat deepens the color and doubles the protective layer inside the grain, one critical safety rule that most channels skip entirely. Rags soaked with linseed oil can spontaneously combust if left crumpled in a pile as the oil oxidizes and generates heat. Always spread used rags flat to dry outdoors or submerge them in water inside a sealed metal container before disposal. This is not optional. It is a life safety requirement. 1 batch in a quart jar covers approximately 30 to 40 square feet. A contractor charges $600 or more for that same coverage area on a single deck pass. A floor refinishing company quotes $3 to $7 per square foot. You just replace that invoice with $3 in materials and 20 minutes of your own time. Your grandparents knew this formula, or at least their grandparents did. It was written in pencil on index cards tucked inside kitchen drawers and passed through workshops and garages across every small town before a television commercial convinced an entire generation that wood care required a brand name and a professional invoice. The wood did not die. It was waiting for someone to remember what the industry spent decades making the world forget. 3 ingredients, 1 jar, 20 minutes. That gray deck you have been avoiding all summer could look new before Sunday. That fence your neighbor says you should replace could be restored before dinner. All for less than a cup of coffee. The formula worked for 20,000 years before the patent era, and it works today. Subscribe and share this with someone who is one contractor, quote, away from spending money they do not have to spend.